it can't just be about data, it also has to be about the methods that we need to actually deploy the data. I mean, data interoperability and standards is important. It's basically the foundation, but it doesn't get you that far, because if then every small community has to reinvent its own tools, then we again are not taking full advantage of what's possible. So you need a layer where you actually also share and standardize to some degree the analytical tools that you need to actually gain access to the data and utilize those data. And we are engaged in this effort between the history of science and bioinformatics for problems in the history of biology, and it is, as you might imagine, not an easy task. Now, but we are sort of encouraged by this, because we can basically adopt many of those methods. Again, I'm not talking through that slide here, but this just shows what's possible with regard to certain types of questions. But what Research Data Alliance also can facilitate is true integration across disciplines. Because it's easy, well, it's difficult, but relatively easy to standardize the use of data within one particular interest field or scientific community. But the real advantage of an effort like this would be that you actually are able to facilitate crosstalk between different scientific communities. And now in the case of computational history of science, history of biology in our case, and the life sciences, we found that we actually can also provide services and inspiration for the life sciences as such. Just the note here, increasingly even the most presentist biologists realize that history seems to matter for many of their problems. They actually would readily accept this if they would get access to the legacy data in the history of their fields. But by and large, and I'm no exception myself, you read what you can get access to easily on your laptop. How many of my colleagues have seen the internal rooms of a library in recent memory? Not many, I can guarantee you that. So there's an interesting challenge to make available the rich and important resource in the history of biology. I give you one example here that is of immediate practical value. We are talking a lot now about climate adaptation. And you heard something about climate sciences yesterday, I believe. Now, what do we know about how in the past species responded to climate change? We know a lot. We have centuries of biodiversity data in often obscure forms that are now rapidly being digitized. What we do not yet have are computational tools and standards to mine those data, yet that would be the most important record that we have in order to predict what might actually happen to certain biological communities if the temperature goes up or humidity drops. We have the data. They are in the legacy material of 350 years of research in biodiversity, and they would be extremely important to have right now. So this is the kind of challenges that we are facing, and this is the kind of challenges that we want to address. Okay, so the need for big and open data in the history of science, I think I gave you already some of the motivations. Let me give you one from the point of view of how to transform the field of the history of science as an example of a humanities discipline. And that's what I would call the shortcomings of the biographical model. Basically what historians of science or many humanities scholars do is they write biographies. Slightly modified biographies. It can be a biography of an institution or an experiment, but it also always follows this model. And if you're a cynic, it goes something like this. A scholar disappears for X number of years into archives and does collect something and has their very own way of standardizing their data collection. Then they disappear for another couple of years into their office and write a book that has footnotes that nobody really understands, and they don't share the results of their 7 years in archives because they are only in their own idiosyncratic system of notebooks. This is not a sustainable way of doing business, in my opinion. So there is more need for transparency, which you can get if you actually open up the data in the humanities, and if that requires, of course, to have an infrastructure such as the one that you are proposing here. It also, there's a need for new publication forms, and the Max Planck Institute for the History of Science and the Max Planck Society at large have moved in that direction by developing what they call the Max Planck Research Library, which allows you a possibility to publish historical analysis in conjunction with the actual sources. So in open access publishing, you can actually digitize your sources and write your text with direct reference into the original sources. Now that's a new form of scholarship that brings in the data and that brings in the transparency. Some of the things that Phil will be talking about is in principle true for the life sciences, but not quite true in practice. Now there are further problems, and that now moves us for the motivation why we actually need computational history, and that's what I would call the increasing orders of magnitude gap and the model scientist trap. Increasingly, we need to be able to understand what science is all about, also for our funders and for society. And historians of science or scholars in the science studies community do an extremely lousy job at that because they don't take science at large into account. So think about the universe of science ever expanding. Think about the universe of humanities scholars or historians of science ever shrinking. And then the majority of those work on the same people. They fill libraries on Darwin and Newton and Galileo, and we have absolutely no idea about what goes on in the huge space of science. It's a big data problem. We don't know where scientific innovation actually happens because we only privilege certain idiosyncratic observations of the model scientist, whether somebody wins a Nobel Prize or not, and that's what's getting studied. We don't know how science works as a large community, as a large interdisciplinary community. So we basically need to look at that as a big data problem, for which we of course need a different type of data structure and computational tools to analyze this. One of the things that we are interested in is, for instance, how do scientific innovations happen? Where do we see changes in our understanding? And that's an interesting question. And I will show you some ways of how we do this with computational tools, but it only really works if you have access to the totality of a particular research problem or research field, and that requires open and big data for the history of science. Okay, now I mentioned before that we get inspired by a kind of a method transfer between the sciences and the humanities. Now, the question of innovation in science is structurally isomorphic to the problem of how do we detect evolutionary novelties in genomes. And here we have, for instance, one extremely interesting case study. Rich Lenski and his group have been running a selection experiment on colonies of E. coli for more than 30 years, and they have more than 70,000 colonies so far, 70,000 generations. They freeze them periodically and have them in a huge freezer storage facility in the basement, even though several prominent institutions have tried to lure Rich Lenski away from Michigan State. It's not possible. He can't move his freezers. He's stuck. But that's big data in one way. And now, of course, they can go back and sequence the genomes of all those previous generations of E. coli, which wasn't even on the horizon when they started this experiment. So there you have an interesting way of having foresight and anticipation of keeping data of a certain sort. Anyway, so what this study shows in interesting ways is that we now can reconstruct what actually is the underlying genomic change that facilitates the observed phenotypic transformation in this context here. And what's interesting is that, to make a long story short, that it is actually not a single mutation that drives the interesting innovations in that experiment, but it's actually a rearrangement of a complex network of interacting genes. And it's the rearrangement of the structure that drives the innovation. So that's the intuition that we develop out of evolutionary theory in trying to detect now conceptual innovation in the history of science as a big data problem. We are looking basically at reconstructing changes in the network of concepts and methods and ideas within scientific fields. It becomes basically a problem of complex adaptive systems. This is just another way of how we begin to understand in science the basis for phenotypic evolution. That's the gene regulatory network by Eric Davidson. This basically is a big data compression. This represents decades of research of a very large lab and their collaborators compressed in one idea. And then you can actually do computational modeling with this. Let's skip this. This is a very esoteric point. But the idea here is now for a field like the history of science as a big data and computational problem is that we see isomorphisms of a fundamental kind between, let's say, genomes and knowledge systems such as science. Both can be characterized by complex networks and graphs. We can detect innovation as changes in the underlying structure of those complex networks. We can expand those networks in a hierarchical fashion to include several types of causes, whether it's a network of concepts and ideas that basically then lives on a social, an institutional network of the way science gets done, and a network that, for instance, focuses on the exchange of materials and technologies. All of the ideas that humanities and social sciences have been emphasizing over the last decades can actually be reformulated along those lines as causal networks with many different kinds of elements. And that's important. Within those networks, we can actually also take care of what humanities really are all about, and that is that meaning is contextual, because that's what biologists also do. A gene is not a gene. A gene only gets its function in a particular context of a cell and of a genome, so it's also contextual meaning. And we can basically then study the developmental and evolutionary dynamics of those knowledge systems, and we can also model that. So the idea here is that there is a common theoretical core that enables the use of shared methodologies, but it only is possible if you actually have the right kind of data structure. So without the right kind of data models, this whole approach doesn't work. So now that was abstract. Now, ever so briefly in the last minutes I give you a concrete case of how we go about this. And there's, for instance, one particular problem that one of my grad students is very interested in, and that is that somewhere in the late 1960s a new scientific field emerged called evolutionary ecology. And the question is, what happened? So there are the standard quotations of historians that emphasize that something happened at that time, but we don't really know what. Okay, another quote, but what's really interesting is if you start looking deeper, then there is there's several, but there's, for instance, one interesting figure, a botanist Bradshaw, who in 1948 basically says there's no connection between ecology and evolution because the timescales are different. And in 1965, he changed his mind and says that actually evolution can work on a very small time scales, both geographically and temporarily, and that then becomes the justification for a field of evolutionary ecology. So for a historian, the question is, what happened? Why did he change his mind? So how do we answer this question? Well, we have some ideas, of course. So there's some change in research methods. There is the importance of a particular network of researchers that Bradshaw was interested in. There was an institutional context because he moved between universities and agricultural research stations. But his ideas also are connected to a whole network of concepts that all of them have an interesting history and all of them change, and more importantly, their relationship changes. So how do we reconstruct this? So that was Bradshaw, but then what about everybody else? So he alone doesn't give us an answer. We have to begin to understand what was the scientific context of a whole field in that period. So how do we do that? Again, so we have a period now from roughly the 1950s to the 1970s. What happened there on a larger scale? How do we reconstruct this? So there are a whole range of, again, debates that we can identify through standard methods, but that's all not really exhaustive. How do we actually get this into a larger time scale? How do we build a computational research question around this? So again, we have several questions, and if we reconstruct this, we can start with defining the relationships between scientists, institutions, organisms, methods, and technologies, standard fare for historians, but now we are doing it actually computationally and with big data. Wrong direction. On top of that, we can actually analyze the research literature. And now this becomes really big data because we are dealing with thousands of research papers and books that need to be analyzed computationally in order to get an exhaustive characterization of what really went on in that time. And then we have to dig into those data, we have to dig into the literature and basically extract the relationship between concepts, because ultimately we want to know what is the actual scientific innovation that's associated with that field of evolutionary ecology. So we start with some archival materials. That's what historians collect, and then they stop. But we turn it into data, because we basically create networks out of those sources, and those networks with their data models are put into shared repositories, and everybody has access to them, and it's transparent because it's the original sources and the results of the analysis, such as those networks. This is just for the computational folks here in the room. This is basically how we do it. It's a contextualized triple. So we extract subject, predicate, object relationships and add a metadata context. And the metadata context is where does this triple come from and who extracted it. Because if you do historical analysis, you can't trust anybody. So we basically also record the metadata, and that's an important topic that I'm sure you have talked about, is information about provenance, but not just the provenance of the source, but also the provenance of the person who analyzes it. And then you can actually do meta-analysis about bias among historians, but that's a side story. In order to get to this, you need a whole computational research system. So we built this, and it starts with a repository. It has a lot of analytical tools. It goes in, don't worry about the details, it goes into various systems. But the important dimension here, that the goal is to connect all of this to the linked open data world. Because if we do that, and it's a lot of work for every case study, it needs to be accessible for everybody else. And we want to pull in data from everybody else too, so we don't want to do everything ourselves. So that's where you end up in the Research Data Alliance universe with this kind of research. So those are some of the tools that we deploy in order to get to the triples. So we get to reconstruct the social institutional networks, then we analyze texts, basically by a whole set of tools from citation-based clustering, whether it's bibliographic coupling and other methods that gives you networks of relationships between texts. That's sort of the phenomenology of a text. Then you go into topic modeling. Now all of those generate a lot of data. And if you look into our research system here, we not only store the texts, we also store the analysis that we do on the text. Because why would anybody want to do those things again? Somebody might. So you have to store the text, the sources, you have to store and make available the tools, and you want to store the results of your computational analysis here. Particularly those that are computationally rather intensive. So some of the topic modeling on large corpora require a lot of computational time. So we have this. It's connected to other repositories with an API. But once we have the characterization of text, we want to dig into the text, sort of digging into the data, and then we want to actually figure out what are the actual relationships between those concepts in our case study, and how do they change through time. So in order to do that, you basically can do statistical modeling, or more importantly, functional annotation. Now, functional annotation, unless you train a computer to do it, is very time-consuming. We built a whole tool surrounding it that allows you to reconstruct those conceptual relationships. Now, what we then have, and that's sort of computational history of science, we have change over time in a whole range of networks. The historical settings and relationships among people and institutions, the topology of the research literature, and for select cases, because you don't want to do that for every paper, we actually have the concrete networks of the conceptual relationships. Now, all of that, again, lives within this computational research tool. Now, over the last several weeks, we have expanded this because we built our system, and we now have a collaboration with at least two institutions, a very intensive one, Indiana and the Max Planck Institute for the History of Science. So now we are building this research system up. We are trying to make it interoperable, but that again brings us right into the Research Data Alliance world, because if it's more than one group doing it, then you have to begin to worry about shared practices and standardization. So we did it for us, and we are now expanding our ideas of metadata standards, of data models and all of that within that larger community. And if you have different types of problems, you have to also be more pluralistic with your data models, but at least then you have to be rational enough that you find shared standards as well as translation between those standards. So this is a brief example of how one of those systems looks in the practice. We have been building it for several years, as I said. A few conclusions. So it should be obvious that computational and big data approaches are transforming the humanities. In the case of the history of science, that actually allows for a very interesting integration between the humanities approaches and scientific questions and problems. But this requires cyber infrastructure. In the case of fields that are sort of late adopters, like many humanities fields, they can actually benefit a lot from what's already done in computational research areas, such as bioinformatics. So you can also have a methodology transfer here. But it only works if you have transparent and linkable repositories and data standards. Now, I don't have to tell you that this requires a culture change within your respective scholarly communities, and then you figure out that academics are about the most conservative group of people on this planet, and so you have to deal with that, but it can be done, and I'll leave it at that.
Manfred, for that particularly interesting talk. I hadn't thought of applying those methodologies to the history of science. It's a really fascinating take on it. We have time for some questions. Are there, well, in fact, let me first, my battery's died, so I can't look. Are there any questions that came in for RDA launch Q? Okay. So, questions from the floor. Yes, there. Sorry, microphone.
Hugo of Scion and the WDS. Have you considered looking at sources of, let's say, relationships between the main players, the publishers, the researchers, the topics, and so on, that does not come from traditional metadata or publication metadata to, let's say, extend and enrich the information that you have available?
Yes. As I said here, in the way I started this was basically an archival source that started this, because that was a document, for instance, that somebody wrote about who he thought were all the people in the field. So we got this source and then tracked down their institutions, their relationships. We are also mining the text per se and find that, for instance, if you want to really understand the links among researchers, the metadata give you co-authors. But we, for instance, also mine acknowledgement sections, because there you often have very interesting references of who gets thanked for particular reasons, and any other type of information that we get our hands on. In order to do this, we needed to define basically standardized practices of how to encode those types of relationships. And I ran over this, but so we have a way to establish those contextual triples that then refer both to the metadata of the source as well as the person who tried to make that call or made that interpretation. Because sometimes it's ambiguous. So you want to know who to blame if it's wrong, basically. So yes, we are doing that.
Okay. So the next two questions are there and there.
Fascinating stuff. I just love history of science. Well, while I'm listening to your describing the sources where your data came from, I was curious about the data pre-processing, how. Do you have any tools, or do you have any like lexical or ontological, whatever taxonomy sources to help you, in the preliminary stage of data processing? That's my first question. And second is, as far as I understand, the metadata issue didn't come at later stage of research. So when you have data and processed, and then when it comes to the analysis stage, and then you realize we need to have metadata to manage those data files. So at which point in the research process that the metadata started to play an important role?
So if I take the second question first, the metadata played an important role right from the beginning, because in a way we were lucky enough, I wouldn't claim smart enough, but lucky enough that from the very beginning we worked with librarians, and they told us that you can't do any of those things unless you worry about metadata. So we actually, for that whole system, have, I think by now it's about over 120 pages manual of metadata of how the different data types you might use in this type of analysis, what you need to do to enter the right kind of metadata so that that becomes usable and coherent both within our system, but also, since we have every intention to share all of that for the rest of the world. So yes, we have worried about that from the beginning. And also for all the different data types that we have. I mean, I showed you only a small subsection of that. In terms of data processing, we are developing routines as we go along. For instance, for many of those computational analysis of texts, even if you do it in the scientific research literature, so I hope there is no representative of various publishers in the room. But anyway, so we basically OCR some of the PDFs and then have practices to clean that up. And again, record all the steps that we do in the metadata, because if you process sort of from an original source and you create various versions, you also need to document what you do to make that transparent. So we have standards for that as well. So yes. And we are learning every day new pitfalls of the trade.
Last question in the middle.
Johannes Kaiser. Johannes Kaiser, Food and Agriculture Organization of the UN. I have two questions regarding your triple stars. First is, what are the frameworks for producing these triples from semi-structured or unstructured information? And the second is, what is the order of magnitude now? How many triples are you processing in this environment?
So we are, again, take the second one first. We are right now reaching sort of a critical inflection point, because we spent most of the last several years building the research system with small cases, so it was a manageable size of a triple store. But now we are actually entering the big data production. And so now it's basically on the thousands of triples that can be generated a day. But we now have to really figure out more effective ways of storing that. So it's currently an ongoing discussion, and I yell at my people every day, I want a solution for the triple store. And yeah, maybe this, that. So it's, but I think if for all of the things that we are trying to do, we are trying to be as little dependent on a particular implementation as possible. So for instance, the API that we built on top of our repository is independent of what kind of repository structure you use by and large. So at least that's what my programmers tell me. And so you can actually have it sit on top of several repositories. And right now we basically are splitting our repository into one that is sort of really curated and the final product, and then another one that we call a more temporary repository where you store for the time being a lot of the intermediate results, and then you're developing a routine at what point do you move things from a more temporary repository or working repository into the standard repository, largely also because we don't want to overwhelm our standard repository right now before we have figured out whether it's actually the right one. So open questions, as you know, and if you have a solution about a triple store, let me know.
Very quick one. Joe McIntyre from...
Please. Yeah.
Sorry?
Yeah, please.
Joe McIntyre, European Bioinformatics Institute. That was absolutely fascinating. I'm going to have to look at your website in more detail. But one question I had was, when you're looking at these co-authorship networks, are you also looking at names from submitters of database records and taking that into account, and how you cope with the horrible problem of ambiguous author names?
Basically what we have, we can talk more after the break, it would be a long answer, but that concept power slide I showed you is basically for all of our terms that we use in triples, but also for people, we basically try to find an authority, and so that makes it a little time consuming, but you really have to do it. And so far we have been able to, in the cases that we worked on, avoid ambiguities of that sort, largely because we spend way too much time trying to disambiguate the data. But you know, if you start doing it, you want to do it right. So but it is a huge problem. That's why we have all those authorization steps in between.
Yeah, I'm actually kind of amazed that we've got to this stage of the conference before somebody mentioned the problem of author name ambiguity. It's a huge, huge opportunity. Please join with me in thanking Professor Laubichler.